This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and it is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Remember, subscribe or follow, depending on what your app lets you do. And of course, leave us that good rating and those reviews. If you could write a review, that would really does help. I'll put a link in our show notes to make it easy for you to do just that. Writing the review, all of this helps get the word out so more people can participate in the conversation like the one we're having today with Bill Kristol. Bill Kristol is editor at large of The Bulwark. He was a founder of the Weekly Standard, where some of my favorite writers of all time were a part of that. And Bill is also a regular guest on leading political commentary shows. Prior to his work at the Weekly Standard, Bill led the Project for the Republican Future, an organization that helped shape the strategy that produced the 1994 Republican congressional victory. I was actually just talking about this last night with two friends of mine. From 1985 to 1993, Bill served as Chief of Staff to Education Secretary William Bennett in the Reagan administration, as Chief of Staff to Vice President Dan Quayle in the George H.W. Bush administration. And before coming to Washington, Professor Kristol taught politics at the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard University. Thanks so much for joining us again, Bill. How you doing?
Great to be with you. I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm hanging in there, man. You know, it's
that's usually my answer. Actually, I was being polite and dressing it up by saying I'm doing fine. Hanging in there is my normal response these days. You know?
But in truth, I got real trouble. The Mets season just already started with a hiccup. They got a rain delay on opening day. I have to wait an extra day for opening day. This is terrible.
That is bad. I was just thinking about opening day and about the Mets actually. Yeah. Well, it's nice though. I feel like baseball season beginning is somehow a sign of I don't know what, the cycle of things. We're still around. We're to enjoy it. It's still happening. The sport's still recognizably what it has been for most of my life. So that's good.
So you grew up on the Upper West Side. Were you a Giants fan, a Mets fan? Mets. Okay. Yeah. All right. Oh, I guess that, by the time you were really going to
the Giants were gone, and my father had been a Dodgers fan, and I was instinctively, and so they the Giants left. I became a baseball fan just before the Mets got started in '62, but I was always an anti-Yankees. I was always this is my sort of slightly left-wing, I guess, personality, hidden beneath my conservative exterior. I always rooted for the underdog. I didn't like the Yankees. They were too good. They were the Bronx Bombers. They were on top. So I rooted for various teams against the Yankees for a couple of years, and then the Mets showed up in '62. And I became a huge Mets fan. They were, of course, terrible for the first 6 years or so ago. And then they won in my senior year in high school? The beginning of my senior year in high school. They won the great World Series victory. So that ended my high school years in a very good way.
It's so funny. A lot of Mets fan stories, real diehard Mets fans. It's similar. I was a little bit. I'm a little bit younger than you, but my first game was in '76. And it was a game, my Aunt Rhoda and Uncle Jerry took us, and it was a game where the cast of Happy Days was playing an exhibition game against the Mets wives. And I fell in love with the team immediately. But then, that year the Yankees went to the World Series and lost to the Reds, but then they won in '77 and '78. And I was really questioning my loyalties. But my family explained to me, it takes no character to be a Yankees fan. You're a Mets fan. And then what do you know? In '77, they traded away Seaver, and I was suffering until the mid '80s. So
yeah, that's very similar. No, it does take good care. Let's pat ourselves on the back about our excellent character from being long-suffering Mets fans.
So actually, now that I think about it, I imagine talking politics in the Kristol household that you grew up in must have been akin to Bronny James' experience of playing basketball in the LeBron James household. I don't know if I'm making a strain of a comparison here, but were you, in all seriousness, were you hesitant to challenge your parents' views, or were you really encouraged to engage with them?
Yeah, I think a little more encouraged. And honestly, they were unpretentious and didn't, they had real intellectual lives, obviously, and many distinguished intellectual friends in New York. But at home, it was, I always say this to people, we didn't sit around usually discussing, great literature over dinner or anything like that. We discussed sports a lot. My father was a big sports fan, and we watched a lot of sports on TV. I went to games, Mets games with him, and I went to Knicks games, Rangers games. So for me, an enjoyable childhood in New York, and enjoyed the city and enjoyed sports, and obviously enjoyed talking politics and ideas with my parents. They told stories about the old days of debating things in the 40s and 50s, but they didn't really, I think I absorbed a lot of their views, obviously,
Sure.
but they were not the type to, force them down my throat.
Did you get to a certain point where you realized that some of your views were really diverging from your parent? Each of your parents had their own distinct set of their own distinct philosophy, but at what point did you realize you had your own philosophy?
So, I think I did mostly agree with them and did throughout most of my life, honestly. And I used to joke that I think there's some truth to this, that most people in my era, I graduated from high school in 1970, most people rebelled against their parents. It was the New Left, it was the youth rebellion and all that. And instead, I rebelled against my generation and agreed with my parents because I saw all my peers. I think there's some truth to this, really, in high school, and I just thought that they were all on the left, and not just the left, but they were all, enamored of the new left and youth culture and don't trust anyone over 30, and we're redefining, reinventing everything. And I was kind of smart enough, I think, to see that was silly. And I respected my parents and their friends and the people they respected, admired. And so I was instinctively conservative in that way, I would say. It was probably, I was joking about this with someone just the other day. Actually, it was funny. Actually, it was our mutual friend, Pete Wayner. And we were talking about how we like to think that we form our political views by reading and studying and observing the world and deciding what we admire the most, what we like the best. And we sign up, so to speak, on that side, or we follow people like that. And there's some truth to that, obviously. But it's also the case that one forms one's political views, in my experience, by what one reacts against, and it's just instinctive, right? And really, for me, the silliness of the mid-'60s, the mid-late 60s, the overreaching of the left, the arrogance of the young left, the damage they did, really, and to many institutions, is what made me something of a conservative as a young person.
Oh, that's it. I was thinking about your professional political trajectory, and you started in your early career. Were you on staff with Pat Moynihan? Do I remember that?
I worked for him for the summer of '76 in his Senate campaign. So I started as kind of a moderate, let's call it a Cold War Democrat.
Okay.
When I was an undergraduate, I volunteered for Scoop Jackson, the really wonderful Democratic senator from Washington State, who was a real Cold War liberal, a very strong anti-Soviet, pro-human rights, foreign policy type, but a moderate liberal in domestic policy. And so that was kind of where I was in the late 60s, early mid 70s. And then, like a lot of people, migrated over to be a Reagan Republican by 1980.
Right. That's quite a trajectory going from Pat Moynihan. But in some ways, you've been consistent. But in other ways, everything around you has really changed so drastically to where, now you're considered a radical left-wing Marxist, the guy who started the Weekly Standard. So I'd love for you, if you could, to kind of chart that trajectory from Moynihan to the Reagan and Bush administrations to Weekly Standard, and now being excommunicated by your,
I don't know how interesting my little trajectory is to everyone, but I'd say, I think I have changed my mind on some things and moved on some things, and then a lot of things have moved around me, obviously. Yeah. I think I'd like to think I've been more consistent than not, and that I'm simply reacting to events and to challenges. I've also done some rethinking, as any of us would as we get older and learn and experience new things. I do think at the heart of my politics always has been a belief in liberal democracy, a dislike, and not just dislike, but a real disgust with and also fear of and authoritarianism and dictatorship and illiberalism of the right and the left. I guess that would be the simplest way to put it. I grew up, my parents were certainly anti-communist liberals. They had been anti-fascist, of course, earlier on. And I think the notion that you should resist illiberalism or authoritarianism of the right and the left was always, I think, there for me. And I admired people like Pat Moynihan, who, of course, who did that, and Jackson and Reagan too, I think, So I think that part has been pretty consistent. And now the world around me changes and the threats change, and the new left looked very dangerous in 1970, and it's the new right that looks very dangerous today. And in fighting these different threats, but also rethink some things. And what was I wrong about some things on the right that led to was American conservatism a little, did it have some flaws in it that led to the current situation on the right and so forth? So you'd have to be foolish not to rethink some things, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting. You're speaking of illiberalism, and we see those tendencies from very distant corners. A lot of folks are talking about it as a horseshoe, far left, far right. I was reading Danielle Allen's book from last year, and then had a chance to talk to her about it. And I was starting to put meat on those bones in terms of just starting with the First Amendment, the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. So when I tell friends that I'm really concerned about the very foundations of the constitutional republic, if there's another Trump term, they think I'm being hyperbolic. But I was wondering if we look at those speech, religion, press, assembly, right to petition the government, those really are. Am I being hyperbolic to think that those are under threat?
No, I mean, you're not. You got one of the 2 major parties has nominated for the 3rd time for president someone who did try to subvert an election that we had here just 3.5 years ago, not 30 years ago, and who explicitly praises Orban. But what is Orban doing in Hungary? I mean, you can disagree about how dire a situation Hungary is in, how authoritarian he is, but he explicitly says he's for a kind of illiberal democracy. He's moved the country in a very authoritarian direction, and that's what Trump admires. And so, leaving aside all the other things one could say, and all the other things Trump has unleashed in terms of, I think, bigotry and threats of violence and a kind of real vulgarization of our politics in dangerous ways, there isn't a core respect for the rule of law, for liberal democracy, for tolerance, for the freedoms of the First Amendment, right? Let's beat up those guys we don't like, that kind of thing. They're enemies of the people, traitors, he calls them, So I think you're right to be alarmed. And I think I wasn't wrong. Many of us weren't wrong to be alarmed, obviously, about threats from the left. And we still are alarmed about the illiberalism of the left and on campuses and elsewhere. I think that it's asymmetrical now, the greater political dangers from the right, but it could be from the left again. And there are local dangers, so to speak, on campuses and elsewhere from the left, and not just on campuses. So, I think defending, for me, that's been my biggest, I guess, not discovery really, but just refocus of the last 6, 7, 8, 9 years, the defense of liberalism, which also means in strengthening liberalism and improving it and dealing with some of its limitations and flaws and weaknesses. But the defense of liberalism really is, I think, core now to my politics. Liberalism in the broad sense of liberal democracy, as you say. The First Amendment freedoms, but also the separation of powers, the constitutional structure that preserves liberty, checks and balances, the whole kind of system we have here that we've been very lucky to inherit in the United States that we can't take for granted.
Yeah. I also think one of the differences is there's a more robust critique of the far left from the center left. I think of I learned a lot from Yascha Monk's book that came out last fall, the Identity Trapper. John Rauch, one of my favorite books of the last 5 years, A Constitution of Knowledge. Greg Lukianoff and John Haidt, their work from a few years ago. But before we move on, I wanted to tell you about something else that's important. Money. Specifically your money. In all seriousness, I wanted to tell you about my advisor and my friend, George Meza. George runs Meza Wealth Management. And with George, it's not just about money. It's about helping us manage our present and plan for our future. And unlike a lot of other firms out there, George and I actually have a relationship. He knows me, he knows my family, and I know his wonderful family. I also know his firm and the incredible team he's put together, from his chief investment officer to some of the other great people in his office, like Jessica, their head of operations, that are always there to help me and with all aspects of our portfolio. You see, the thing is, I got a lot going on. I guess we all got a lot going on, and I don't have the time to watch our investments all day, every day. And even if I did, I don't have the experience and expertise that George's team collectively has. So we get the entire Meza Wealth Management team, all their expertise and all their integrity. And again, it's based on George knowing me personally, knowing my goals, and even the kind of risk that's appropriate for me to take, which, by the way, could change from one season to the next. And they're on top of all of that. So if you want George Meza and Meza Wealth Management to be on your team, just visit their website, mezawealth.com. That's MEZA wealth.com, www.mezawealth.com. And that will also be in our show notes, so you can check that. And now, back to our show. I've also been thinking about the hijacking of really wonderful words. You know, the words like conservative. You were known as a leading conservative, albeit a neocon, they might have called you, but a conservative nonetheless in the tradition of Burke, and maybe picking up where William F. Buckley, was passing a torch to great thinkers that you had as colleagues at the Weekly Standard, for example. In a recent piece, you wrote, "The conservative movement is defending authoritarianism, embracing Viktor Orban, and for that matter, Vladimir Putin in broad daylight." So this is something I wanted to ask you about because we haven't talked about it yet on this program. You said the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 for an authoritarian Trump second term exists in broad daylight. So for those that are unfamiliar, can you shed light, so to speak, on Project 2025?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big volume, a big project with a lot of people involved, a lot of money behind it, to staff up the Trump administration and to develop policies for the Trump second term that would move us, in my opinion, in a very authoritarian direction. They would say, I suppose, that it's just breaking up the deep state and making sure that we can have a government that's responsive to Trump and to the people, and getting back to founding principles. I guess I'm not sure whose founding principles, however, but it's when you really look through it, I mean, the degree to which it just makes Trump, it removes so many of the barriers that we've gotten used to here in the United States. Maybe some of them are a little unnecessary. Some of them are a little too tall, so to speak. They need to be reformed. I'm open to that. But it just sweeps away these barriers that do protect civil servants, that protect the rule of law, that make sure that the president can't tell the parts of the Justice Department to let's just go after Corey Nathan and look at his, and see what, investigate him, even if we have no grounds to, or have the IRS look at his tax returns. All these things we just assume is part of a sort of well-functioning liberal democracy with oversight and transparency and the rule of law. And again, we fall short on all these things, obviously. I think Heritage's project would really remove or weaken a lot of those guardrails. And in that respect, it's very much consistent with what Trump tried to do in his first term. He didn't succeed much because some of the guardrails were quite strong then. And there were people in office who weren't really Trump acolytes. They were Republicans, conservatives, but they upheld the guardrails against Trump.
Right.
I mean, and some of them I don't even approve very much of other things they did. But think of Bill Barr, think of Mike Pence. Sure. Think of McMaster, think of Mattis, think of Mark Esper, the defense secretary. I mean, they did some things I don't like, but they did some very good things for the country. And they stopped Trump from doing some of the things he wanted to do. Heritage's project and Trump's own project is not they don't get to stop me next time. No guardrails next time. It's Trumpism all the way down. Right. And I think people can laugh at Trump and say, well, does he really know anything? He's kind of a clown, he's just a demagogue and all. But once you unleash these things, he personally may not, I don't think he has very good intentions and very good character, and he's willing to indulge violence and lawlessness himself, but also the kinds of people who would be in there unchecked. What does a country look like when the Defense Department loses the whole network of institutions and norms and customs that ensure civilian control of the military and orderly behavior within the military and non-arbitrary punishments within the military? And we just take so much of that for granted, right? But we know that elsewhere in the world, it doesn't work that way. Right. Elsewhere in the world, arbitrariness and personal willfulness and bigotry all can rule. And I think, one thing I've been struck by is I too was sort of subject to a kind of American exceptionalism or a belief in that. It couldn't happen here, but it could happen here. And some of it did begin to happen here under Trump. And certainly January 6th happened here. And the idea that Trump's the nominee again after January 6th, that for me is very unnerving. And people aren't unnerved enough by that.
So you referred to it, I think it was in this piece, or maybe it was another piece that you wrote recently. You called it the Trump normalization syndrome. So if you would explain what you mean by that, but also what do you attribute the Trump normalization syndrome to?
I think I stole that phrase from maybe David Corn or someone, but anyway, well, just the fact that everyone, a lot of conservatives who aren't, and in their hearts, Trumpy, so to speak, but they still sort of have accommodated him, and they kind of make excuses when he says the kind of outrageous things, when he has no respect at all for the American legal system. When he thinks, fine, if I'm in trouble with the law, I attack the judge. I try to poison the jury pool. I try to delay. I try to use anything I can do just to turn the system to my advantage. And of course, every defendant tries to take advantage of certain parts of the law, but Trump is kind of way beyond all of that. And so we don't take seriously enough the degree to which he's not just another player in the traditional American political system or legal system or system of public debate. He wants it all distorted to his own personal ends. But we don't want to see that in a way. We don't want to acknowledge, I think, how dangerous that is and how unfortunate it is that he's at such a high level in our system with those goals, with those ends. And so we sort of normalize Trump and we pretend, well, he's just there's Nikki Haley and there's Joe Biden and there's all these other people, and then there's Donald Trump, and they're all just kind of jostling around. But that is not the right way to think about it.
I've noticed again and again, and maybe I'm just I came up with a hypothesis and just want to prove it, and it's a confirmation bias, and that is it's partisan malice. That a number of my friends just can't bring themselves to ever vote for somebody with a D before their name. So it's almost like they're getting in shape. They're inching ever closer to the notion of voting for Trump and getting behind this movement. And the exercises they're doing is by, learning a way to talk about January 6th. Not quite dismissing the guys who were violent, but saying a lot of those guys just walked in, and being able to find a way to get their heads around normalizing it, as you say, and there's any number of other issues, explaining away Trump, like talking about Trump. Oh, well, everything was great, okay, so there was a worldwide pandemic, but that wasn't his fault, and everything was great under Trump, forgetting about Helsinki, forgetting about Charlottesville, forgetting about any number of other policies. And then doing these counterfactuals like, this, Israel, this never would have happened under Trump. So to me, it's like a moral and intellectual workout to get themselves in shape to vote for Trump again in 2024.
No, I think that's very well said, actually. I mean, the version of it I've been saying, which is really a cousin of what you're saying, very similar to what you're saying, is I think a lot of people originally, look, they thought they could manage Trump. They thought we could live with one term of Trump. It would be better than Hillary Clinton. It wasn't I didn't think that was correct, but it wasn't crazy to think that perhaps that once elected, he'd get more serious, more respectful of the institutions. He wasn't going to govern the way he sounded like when he was at his worst, when he was being a demagogue during the campaign. Well, it turned out he didn't respect the institutions. He didn't respect the norms. First day of his presidency was the second day. He went to the CIA and just made clear he had no appreciation for any of these people who've, sacrificed for America and for the well-being of America. It's all just for him personal. He's in charge and he wants to do what he wants to do, kind of thing. But as people talk themselves into, people started off being reluctantly accepting of Trump in a very tentative and temporary way. One term, better than Hillary. Let's make sure Jim Mattis and other people are there to check him, But it's hard to sustain that psychologically, I think. Don't you think? I mean, it's hard to sustain a position of very reluctant sort of acquiescence. And then he's attacked by a lot of people like me, but by a lot of from the left. And then you want to defend him a little. So then it's like, I was reluctantly for him, but, I think he's doing better than people realize. And those attacks are unfair. And the Russia thing is a hoax, even though Paul Manafort met with the Russian government. And even though Putin, Trump asked for Russia's help, and even though Russia released the WikiLeaks emails, the afternoon of the Access Hollywood tape to try to blunt the effect and so forth. And I'm just going to, get indignant about the left. And I'm going to pretend Trump is actually a little better than I expected. And then 6 months, 1 year later, it's, he's doing some good things there. And I don't even know why are people like Secretary Mattis doing what he says instead of trying to check him. And the degree to which people moved in a very step-by-step way from reluctant acceptance of Trump temporarily to sort of enthusiastic support for Trump is pretty striking. And there are still some who want to say I'm just reluctant, as you sort of said, they can't stand the alternative, so that they sort of talk themselves into accepting. That's still going on too. But the degree to which people I know personally, and I mean you too, I'm sure, have kind of slid on down that slide and are now pretty much all in. It's as I say, it's hard to, if you're in politics or in intellectual combat even, it's hard to sustain that kind of very qualified support. And and they've managed to go from that to pretty all out support in many cases. I mean, Nikki Haley for me is the test for all the Republicans. I mean, I'm now, more probably I'm a moderate Democrat, honestly. So, I'm not the best case study of this, but all those people who want to be Republicans, all those people who just can't take the Democrats for reasons either silly, in my opinion, or some legitimate ones. If you're really strongly pro-life, and on some issues, you just can't, that's not a party that you're going to be comfortable with, or maybe even be in good conscience can vote for. But so I respect people who are, don't want to be on the Democratic side of the aisle. But okay, we had an actual Republican primary contest. It ended up coming down to Trump and Nikki Haley. If those people really had to be Republicans, but really didn't like Trump, the way they were sort of saying occasionally that they didn't like him, they could have really gone all in for Nikki Haley. Now, she was an underdog. It probably she wasn't going to beat Trump. So maybe why should you spend all too much time working on it? But that's not the way you think in politics. If you have a chance to save your party and save your country, someone who you probably agree with a lot, wouldn't you fight hard for it? What was striking for me is none of them really did that, right? It turned out they didn't, they were okay with Trump winning.
Yeah.
He was, now to be fair, it was kind of fatalistic because he was the strongest. Maybe he was going to win anyway. But for me, that was very revealing. The failure to sort of, they would say to me, well, how can he be for Biden? He's big, blah, blah. And I would say back, okay, fine. So what are you doing? Are you helping Nikki Haley a lot? Well, not really. I don't think it's going to happen. I mean, so.
That a fatalism, that's an interesting way to think of it, because I'm trying to figure the political calculation and not pushing your chips in behind Nikki Haley. There was a slim chance, but a chance nonetheless. So that it's an interesting exercise. I mean, she got 20% of the vote in Arizona after she folded up her campaign. So it's I can't make sense of it.
Or just, I mean, not to interrupt, but just thinking more, leave aside Haley's maybe, okay, you didn't think she could win. Let's say you're pro-Ukraine, which you should be, people should be. And, there you are, you're on board with helping Ukraine and stuff. And then you look up and Trump's your likely nominee. You'd think you would spend whatever political capital you had in pushing and telling Trump, look, you need to change your mind and be open to changing your mind on Ukraine if you're going to get all of our support. We're not just going to that's a very fundamental issue. Ukraine, Putin, NATO. And we're not just going to go along, because you happen to be winning the nomination. You need to kind of earn our support, and one way you would earn it is by changing your view on this issue, getting educated on this issue, deferring to some others on this issue, overcoming your prejudice against Zelensky and for Putin and so forth. How many people are even saying that, though? A few of them are going to vote for Ukraine aid in Congress, which is good, but they're not really spending a lot of time trying to adjust and modify Trump's views and policies to make them more acceptable. They're spending much more time telling themselves that they have no choice but to accept Trump and his policies because the left is so terrible and so terrifying.
Yeah. Your colleague, Will Salatan at The Bulwark, wrote this incredible treatise released last summer about, I forget exactly what it's called, but it's like the devolution of Lindsey Graham.
Right.
And I was as you were speaking, that's who I was thinking of. Who would have that conversation with Trump? I think early in his first and hopefully only term, he might have had that conversation. He has the gravitas or the experience with foreign affairs to have that conversation. No, this is the most efficient and effective way to be a bulwark, if you will, against the authoritarian progression of Putin's regime, and with no risk, no life and limb at risk, and a very efficient use of our dollars. In fact, in some ways, you can make the case there's a business plan that you could write that it's in fact, we're replenishing our defenses due to our support of Ukraine. So it's a boon to our economy here in some ways. That's who. But Lindsey Graham's not having that conversation now. I can't and I don't know who else would. He's lost to Jim Mattis. He's lost to his H.R. McMaster. He's lost John Bolton. There's nobody around him that's going to dare say, sir. I think
he's not going to permit. He's not going to bring in people around him. But see, he can lose all those people, but he could have people like that. He could say, look, I have my views, but I also understand that I'm head of a large party, the Republican Party, and I may not be right on everything. So I'm going to have a minister, cabinet. What did Lincoln call it?
Cabinet of rivals, team of rivals.
Yeah, I mean, Lincoln didn't call it maybe, but people said it about Lincoln's cabinet.
Yeah.
Cabinet of rival. I could have some serious people in there. Nikki Haley was in his first cabinet, and I'm going to rethink the whole question of. I'm not going to be quite where Biden is, but I'm going to have an open mind when I go back in and take a look at all the information that I haven't seen for 4 years. That obviously that's 180 degrees from his attitude, from the way he thinks about things. He knows who he likes and who he doesn't like, and he's going in to help the ones he likes and punish the ones he doesn't like.
Yeah, indiscriminately. That's what scares me. I've only skimmed the surface of that Project 2025, but it seems to me to be a business plan to execute Trump's worst impulses. And I don't believe that he has policy convictions. I think that his convictions have to do with his own aggrandizement, his own wealth building, his own, power, his own, the assertion of Trump himself. But those around him, the thinkers in the Heritage Foundation, do have certain policies, prescriptions. Stephen Miller, he's not my cup of tea, to say the least, but that dude certainly has, as warped as it might be, a political philosophy. So I think that's what's going to latch on to the Trump administration, Project 2025. I do need to dig into that a little bit further to understand it better. But I did want to ask you, last time we talked, we hadn't talked about the project for the Republican future. And I see some parallels in what you're doing today. Am I wrong? So your work in the early to mid 90s, was it similar to any of the work you're doing today with endeavors like Republican Accountability Project, Defending Democracy Together?
I mean, similar in the sense of trying to raise some money and change things, from a relatively little group on the outside, but different in the sense that there we were trying to kind of rejuvenate the Republican Party after 12 years of Reagan Bush, give it some fresh thinking, some fresh ideas. But it was in accord with Reagan and Bush, and so right. I don't think we were fundamentally challenging, and I didn't think we needed to fundamentally challenge kind of basic tendency of Republican policies, because we mostly agreed with them. Now it's pretty different in the sense that we are attempting Republican voters against Trump, the Republican Accountability Project, to rally those who are still Republicans and ex-Republicans against Trump and Trumpism. If need be, to join with the Democrats to make sure there's a majority who are in favor of democracy. Now, whether we can save the Republican Party 2 years or 10 years from now is an open question, honestly, in my mind. But in the short term, the key is to stop Trumpism from prevailing again.
Yeah, what strikes me about that campaign, and I encourage everybody to go to Republican Voters Against Trump and watch some of those testimonies. Were there any particular testimonies that really caught your? I mean, one after the other is so compelling. Were there any that stood out for you?
In 2020, there were a couple of ones of kind of colorful characters and stuff. In general, I was just very moved by it. I mean, we really we spent a fair amount of time trying to find these people. It wasn't that easy because you got to get actual people to volunteer to do this, do it on their phones. They said what they wanted to say. They were public. Obviously, they were videos. And, they were going to get criticized by friends, relatives, people at work for speaking up against Trump. Most of them came from areas that were pretty Republican, and most of their friends and acquaintances were Republican. That's why they were Republicans, right? They were Republicans against Trump. I mean, we were pretty strict and it wasn't just a bunch of Democrats pretending that they were like ex-Republicans or something, This time, we've got 160, I think, they told me today already, of the testimonials that are former Trump voters.
Specifically Trump voters,
voters against Trump, but they're former Trump voters against Trump, either
right.
one or two-time Trumpers. So these are people who took a gamble on Trump. They thought, better than Hillary, shake things up, whatever. And now they're looking, especially after January 6th, I think, and saying, no, never again. And we did find in a lot of the work we did, that these kinds of testimonials had more effect on swing voters than some glossy ad from Washington, D.C. or New York or L.A. that, some actors explaining why you shouldn't be for Trump or something like that. But voters they've seen so many of these over the last years and decades. They have a high discount, factor when they see them. Whereas people like them saying, "Hey, look, I'm not crazy about Joe Biden. I'm pro-life. I'm a veteran. I have always been more comfortable with the Republican Party. There's some real problems with some of the things the Biden administration has done. Afghanistan, for example, several mentioned. But this is the choice we have, and the right thing for the country is to be for Biden, and I'm going to vote for him. I voted Republican almost all my life. Voted for Trump even last time, maybe, or in 2016. But I'm voting for Biden. I mean, those things turn out to be very compelling because a lot of people see themselves in that. And they don't seem like manufactured, ads, and they don't seem like glossy testimonials that are unrealistic. One problem with American politics is, of course, if you think about it for a minute, well, why couldn't the Biden campaign is 10 times as much, 20, 50 times as much money as we have? Why don't they do these ads? And of course, they can't really do it, right? I mean, the Biden campaign is going to put out a lot of 30-second ads that Joe Biden's the greatest ever. No mistakes. They're not going to say, you know what, Afghanistan was screwed up. But nonetheless, that's not as bad as what's going to happen. You can hold that against Biden all you want, and you're absolutely legitimate for you to do so. But that's not. But you still have to vote for Biden against Trump. They're not going to put an ad in that spirit.
Right.
They're not going to put out an ad that Biden miscalculated inflation or whatever. They're going to put out ads. Everything Biden did was great. Everything Republicans have ever done is horrible. And those turn out not to be. Maybe they're good for rallying the base, and you can't expect the Biden campaign to put out ads that aren't very pro-Biden. But it leaves a lot of room for a group like ours to get to your kind of original question about what we're, sort of the point of the group, the spirit of the group almost, to really speak, I think, to those swing voters, whether they're literally former Republicans or just independent voters who've often voted Republican in the past or are mixed, who have mixed political views and mixed political pedigrees. I think it speaks to them and says, look, there's room for you here in this broad coalition against Trump. And then we can debate tax policy or 15 weeks as opposed to 6 weeks, as opposed to no restrictions on abortion or details of foreign policy. We can debate all that later, but we've got to stop. For now, we've got to stop Trump. But I think that broad coalition, what did Ben Wittes call it, the coalition of democratic forces, I think that's a very important thing. And I'm proud to be a small part of that. I think the Biden people have welcomed that. I think they could do more, honestly, to encourage that. Shouldn't Biden have Romney and Liz Cheney and people and Nikki Haley even into the White House? And they may not support him, but just say, look, I respect what you've done. Mike Pence, I respect what you did on January 6th. And I don't, you said you don't want to support me or Trump. That's fine. But I just want to say that I welcome people who admire what you did, Mike. And I wanted to have you here to lunch to thank you. I mean, I think the Biden people haven't been nearly as forward leaning as they might be in reaching out to people like that, partly because it's the right thing to do, but partly because it would send a signal to a lot of people out in the country who maybe, kind of identify with those kinds of Republicans who stood up to Trump.
I do think there's an opportunity for Biden to do in the general now the equivalent of what he did early in the primaries in 2020. And that is he's done a little bit of this, like going to Michigan and speaking to folks who are sympathetic with Palestinian citizens. They've just inched forward in that direction. But overall, I'm curious. I was thinking of it if the shoe was on the other foot. If some of my friends genuinely see President Biden as a threat to the country, do you think the same sort of effort, like the testimonies of the former Trump voters who are definitely not voting for Trump, regular citizens speaking into their phones, do you think this sort of effort would be effective if it was former Biden voters, like finding scores of former Biden voters, specifically in swing states, who will absolutely not be voting for him in 2024? And then I'll ask this on a related note, do you think Donald Trump has been able to add voters the way that Biden's campaign is starting to do, building this broad coalition that you're talking about?
No, I think it would be effective. There are clearly some people, I don't agree with them, but who think Biden's just been so disappointing they can't stay with him. And obviously in politics, as in life, if you see other people, especially people who you respect or people who are kind of seem similar to you in some ways in terms of their situation in life and their views about life, if you see them saying this, it kind of reinforces your tendency. Oh, okay, I guess I'm not crazy. I'm not the only one who thinks Biden really screwed up. And this guy I'm seeing in this testimonial thinks so too. And he seems like a sensible guy. So I think they would be effective. I'm kind of glad the Trump campaign hasn't thought to do that much. They haven't thought to do it because Trump's own instinct is so much against it, of course. That's not Trump's style, right? To reach out to people who've been against him, to sort of acknowledge that there's some criticisms and there are reasons people might not once have been too eager to embrace him. Look at the way he's treated Nikki Haley and the way he's treated Nikki Haley's voters. They're expelled, they're excommunicated, right?
Yeah.
MAGA, you're no longer welcome in MAGA world or whatever. I think that's good for Biden, honestly, that Trump has that attitude. But it is, I mean, he would be more effective if he spent a lot of time thinking about how to get over the Nikki Haley voters instead of just assuming they'll come home because Republicans usually come home at the end, or just disdaining them for being, rhinos or whatever.
Oh, man. Yeah, one other thing is just more of a geeky thing. I noticed in the relaunch of Republican Voters Against Trump, RVAT, is that what you call it, by the way? I've just been seeing it that way. So in my head,
we call it RVAT.
Okay.
Yeah.
That it's 6 swing states that are being targeted: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada, but not North Carolina. Other folks I know.
We might expand to North Carolina. I myself have been arguing for that. And there's some just technical and practical reasons why. We worked a lot in those states in 2022. We have a bigger network in some of those states. Of these voters who then you can get to do the testimonials, which creates others. So, it gives you a jump start kind of. But I'm thinking that we should probably expand to North Carolina, and we might do that.
Well, if you tell Sarah Longwell that Corey said you got to do this,
okay,
I'm sure
I will tell her. Yeah.
No, actually, Mike Madrid is somebody I follow pretty closely. He's been on the show a few times, and man, that dude, when it comes to numbers, his friend Ron Steslow says he eats numbers for breakfast. So he's been looking at North Carolina as one of the 7 as well. So.
And Mike thinks it is a genuine swing state, right?
Yeah. The other question I had for you is: do you put any weight in this the difference of money? One of Trump's former comms directors pointed out an interesting fact about the RNC's cash on hand. It stood at just over $11 million as of the writing, when I read the report. And at this same time in 2020, it was 77 million. How significant do you think that is?
I'm sort of doubtful about the great significance of those things. I mean, that a lot of money matters. If people don't know you, you have to introduce yourself to them. You have to beat back attacks. But everyone knows these 2 candidates. One was our most recent president. One is the current president. Every attack's been made on both of them. Every attack's been responded to. So I think the normal, if you're thinking of it as advertising, commercial advertising, right? A lot of money to promote a brand new product. That's really worth a lot, right? Because otherwise people just don't know much about it. Or a product that's got limited knowledge and a couple of bad perceptions that you could fix with a lot of money. A lot of money to promote Coke and Pepsi. I don't know. The whole country's decided I like Coke, I like Pepsi. You can move a 1% probably. I'm making this up, but Coke's market share is 36% and Pepsi's is 31% or something, and you can move it to 35, 32 maybe. It's not going to change radically. That's more the situation we're in this race. So I think money is less, important, less decisive. Now, having said that, having more money does help you push the needle some.
It doesn't hurt.
I think Trump's spending all that money on the lawsuits. That's probably not helping in the RNC. On the other hand, he's running I got to say, I'm a little worried about kind of overconfidence in some of these aspects. Trump ran a pretty good campaign, has run a pretty good campaign so far. For all of his own personal craziness, sometimes at these rallies and saying things that presumably would put off people. It wasn't obvious he was going to get renominated. It wasn't obvious that they would just blow DeSantis up. It wasn't obvious that he could keep Haley below 45% everywhere and below 35% in most places, most everywhere else than New Hampshire. And they did that. And so I'm a little worried that there's a kind of liberal and also never Trump, actually, underestimation of Trump and Trump world. I think we went through that in 2016, and I don't want to go through that again.
Yeah. I want to shift gears for a second. I was reading, this might have been from a couple of years ago, actually, but I was reading a David Brooks essay in The Atlantic about a trip that he took to a Young Conservatives convention. And one of the more interesting things that he heard somebody say was, "We'd like to dislike Bill Kristol, but he got us all jobs." So I was wondering a few things. One is, when did you start because it's clear that you've actively helped folks, given them a hand up, opened a door for them. Folks, charted their own careers, but you've been an active supporter and cheerleader for a lot of burgeoning careers. When did that start to become a real value and a focus for you?
It's a good, I think I was lucky to be in reasonably high positions in the Reagan administration and then in the George H.W. Bush White House as Vice President, Chief of Staff at a pretty young age. So when you have a senior job, one of the things you can do is hire other people for slightly less senior jobs, and also recommend people for jobs elsewhere in the government or elsewhere in politics. And then when I started the Weekly Standard, we had a great team there, a great group, but then you also have relationships with other newspapers, magazines, TV networks, and so forth. So I think just because maybe I had the ability to help people, I was happy to do it. And it's a great way it's very interesting to meet young people and see what they're up to and make some judgment and hopefully give them a little bit of a help in getting going off. And that first job is the key, the first step, then they prove themselves and they're off to the races, And the truth is, before 2015, I guess, it's funny that you met, I haven't really thought about this in a while, but before 2015, I had sort of a big tent attitude towards a lot of conservatives, so and moderates and liberals too, for that matter. I mean, if you were a bright young person, I thought, what, it'd be great if you could make your way here in Washington in think tanks or politics or electoral politics or on the Hill as a staffer. And I'm happy to make a call, or never big conceal like I was, doing anything extraordinary. I was pretty easy, honestly, usually. But if I have a friend working somewhere, I'll make a call, and or write a note. And so that was the kind of thing I did. And, I thought most of these people, there were some people I wouldn't, of course, recommend if you were a strong Pat Buchanan supporter who thought the, Jewish conspiracy was behind getting us into World War II or something. I wasn't interested in helping you particularly. But there were a lot of different kinds of conservatives, moderates, as I say, even liberals, whom I think I tried to help a little bit. 2015 changed all that, because at that point, then it was suddenly, well, no one in the Trump world was cared if they didn't want me to recommend. They didn't want my recommendation, there. And I myself didn't really want to help Trumpists ascend, in the Republican Party or in think tanks or whatever. So it is another way in which, before 2015, for all the fights we had and already the partisanship and the polarization, which was already there, of course, and all the disagreements and this and that, it was still different. You thought that basically the country was better off by having a lot of intelligent younger people, chiming in. And even if they had slightly different views from you on issue A or issue B, it's probably a good thing in general. And after 2015, just everything changed with Trump.
So the Weekly Standard is such if you get a chance to go back to some of those collections, it's such a fun read, because I would imagine that part of your job was just recruiting these great writers, these great
Most
thinkers.
of it, I didn't do that much writing, honestly. I wasn't one of the best writers. And no, a lot of it was recruiting. A lot of it was keeping them on board, keeping the morale kind of, and the workplace kind of, atmosphere.
Yeah.
Hopefully kind of upbeat and helpful, finding new people. And no, it was a wonderful job in the sense that because we had such a great group to begin with, and then people kind of, it's a little bit self-fulfilling. You found this, I'm sure, too, that it's, in a way, it's lucky that if you start off with a good group, other people want to join that group, other good people want to join, and then they're there, and then it's an even better group, and then other people want to join. So a lot of it was a kind of, I'm not saying everything was great or perfect, but I think to the degree it was good, it's sort of, it was due to me, but it was also due to David Brooks and Andy Ferguson and Chris Caldwell and so many other people who were there, who also had their own networks and their own fans and their own sparring partners. And so we had a very lively intellectual, I think, firmament sort of around us.
Yeah, some of my favorite writers. And then looking at some of the other folks who were involved, you had some folks become Stephen Hayes and some folks become Tucker Carlson. Tucker's that's a whole other story. He's a good writer, though. I mean, if you look at some of his essays,
his early work when he was in his 20s, some of the pieces he wrote, over the years, I got to kind of be quite familiar with people's younger writers. They often could be very good and very promising, but it takes a couple of years to figure out how to write a long profile piece often, right? And you need a good editor like Richard Starr, Claudia Winkler, some editors to help you with that, and get some advice from Fred Barnes or someone who's done this a million times. Tucker, at age 24, something like that, I got to say, wrote some of the most polished pieces. And they weren't all political. They were profiles of interesting characters, on the campaign trail or whatever. They certainly didn't reflect his current political views. He was very favorable to McCain and to others, but he was a very gifted reporter and writer in his 20s.
Yeah, we had Tina Nguyen in here a few weeks ago, and Tina worked for Tucker in his post-Weekly Standard pre-Fox days, and talks about a Tucker that is probably very unfamiliar to most of America these days. So it is interesting. Talk about trajectories. That's quite a trajectory. Well, I want to ask you the TPNR question. It's the one that we ask everyone toward the end of each conversation. And that is, what do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences? So people who have different backgrounds and beliefs than we do, who get their news from different sources than we do. How can we just do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other? Or is it even possible?
Well, they should certainly watch your show here and your admirable efforts to do this. I don't know. I don't think there is really, I mean, I've been involved, as you have, in many efforts of this kind over the last decade or so. And I hope some of them have borne fruit. But the one thing I've learned is people are in very different places, and it's a huge country, right? And there are different ways in which you can reach out to others, and if people are in a certain church or faith community, that's one way. And if you're in a business environment, that's another way. And if you're in Washington, the whole world, that's a very different world. And probably not to think that there's one magic solution, but do what you can, start doing what you can, and see what works. I'm pretty empirical on these things. I have certain presumptions, you do too. We all do, about what might work and what might not. And this argument's better than that. One thing I learned with Sarah Longwell doing the Republican voters against Trump is, these testimonials, which, are these individuals saying why they, in 2020 and now to get in 24, why they won't vote for Trump. They're very different people. And some of the ones I thought were very effective, a lot of people didn't really, cotton to that much as voters. And then some of the ones I thought were kind of wacky, people really loved. So you can't tell what's going to work, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And if someone tries something and it starts to take off locally, you should keep doing it. And then you should certainly publicize it and try to get other people to do it. And something you thought was a great idea, let's have a meeting at 7 p.m. every Tuesday night and let's have a debate between these two people. And then it turned out, people weren't very interested. It didn't really change anyone's minds. Okay, we'll move on to try something else. I think you and I were talking about this before the podcast began, we're in such an unusual time, kind of unprecedented, really, that it's foolish to think that we know ahead of time exactly what means will work to get us out of this mess we're in. I think we know directionally where we want to go. I don't think that, for me, that's not a big, I think I have a pretty firm view on that. But how to do it, I think we need a lot of experimentation.
Yeah, absolutely. And some folks, I don't think it's one big sweeping program. I think it's a lot of little individual programs. Some of them are larger than others, like one of your former colleagues, David Brooks, his involvement with Braver Angels and his advocacy for Mani Guzman and her ambassadorship there. And John Roush is also involved in that organization. And just a general disposition, or my friend Liz Joyner at the Village Square. A lot of folks are recognizing some of the same symptoms in the culture and are doing creative things about it. So I'm encouraged, if not by a snap of the fingers and it's all solved overnight, but these little... I got to come up with a different analogy, but it's more like trench warfare as opposed to just, bam, here's a solution, you're cured, 1 inch at a time, one conversation at a time.
I'm encouraged if you're encouraged. So that's you're in touch with a lot of these people. Yeah, trench warfare seems a little grim. Maybe you should cover it better. It's more like, I don't know, scouting expeditions.
There you go. Yeah.
And you don't know quite what's going to take off, but then some of them do maybe.
So you've been hesitant to give Tim in your now that you're on the podcast more frequently. What does Will call it? The ponies, the shiny. Are you hopeful? Is there a hopeful, if not about the outcome of this particular election, but about this American experiment overall?
Yes, I mean, I think it'd be silly to vote to. I mean, we've overcome a lot over more than almost 2.5 centuries now, and. Yes, and look at America. I mean, look at the inventiveness, the entrepreneurship. I think the decency that prevails, despite some erosion of it, honestly, because of the battering it's taken from demagogues and from the bigots and so forth. But it's still that kind of sense of, I was talking to a journalist from Europe just a few hours ago, and she was struck by this. She has a little baby, and she and her husband are here. And I asked them, just how they found it living here. I mean, and she said she really was struck by just the way in which Americans, it is still, very open society. It's not like the country she's from where, it would take years to be sort of accepted or invited into some group or to someone's home, or, there'd be suspicion. And if you were from this, if this is the country you're from, maybe you wouldn't get along with that person. And the degree of sort of American, I think, tolerance and openness, creativity, and so forth remains great. We have a pretty dysfunctional politics right now, and that can do a lot of damage. I mean, people say, well, culture is upstream of politics and all that. Well, yeah, but politics can also damage the culture a lot. Mm. And it has been, honestly, I think. But I still think we have a lot of resources here to fall back on and to mobilize to help, shape a better future.
Yeah. All right, 2 more questions, and I'll get you out of here. One is, do you have any questions for me?
Well, what have you learned? So you've been doing this for a while. What's the one thing that's different from what you expect, that you've learned that you didn't expect?
I think there's an expression from a mid-century Jewish theologian, the sanctity in the mundane, and applying that to this kind of work there is a profundity in having one conversation with someone who you have passionate disagreements over, whether it's one thing or an entire philosophy, and just having one good conversation, or when damage has been done and you've gotten in a fight and you haven't talked for months, and then just simply saying, hey man, how you doing? Or, that's an interesting thought. I'd love to talk to you about that, and kind of rekindling that flame. So I've learned how to do that. And I've already mentioned Braver Angels, but Monty Guzman's book from about little over a year ago, I never thought of it that way. Rausch talks about this, which he expounded upon in that book. And it's a general disposition that I try to be aware of and I try to practice, and it takes practice. And that is, instead of assuming the contentious disposition, getting ready for the debate, and having any number of ready pieces of rhetorical ammunition to throw at my opponent's, argument, my disposition is one of radical curiosity, and leaving room for the possibility that at some point in this conversation, I might say, I never thought of it that way. Have one of those moments. And the irony and the poetry, you talked about, I think you talked about at one point, God's sense of humor, I forgot the word you used, but it was like a dark humor that God sometimes has. Okay. The dark humor is that sometimes having that curiosity and leaving room for the possibility that this person might give me a moment of, oh, wow, that's interesting. I never thought of it that way. Ironically, makes me more persuasive. So those are a few things. It's I don't know if it's an entire recipe, but it's a few ingredients that I think are leading me in the right direction.
No, that's great. That's really interesting.
So before we go, how can folks follow you at the Bulwark, Defending Democracy Together, all the great work that you're doing?
So thebulwark.com, you can subscribe for free and get most of the material. We can get my morning newsletter I do with Andrew Egger, which we took over from Charlie Sykes about a month ago, and a lot of other work by Jonathan Last and others. If you pay a little bit, you can get full access to all the podcasts and everything else. So that's thebulwark.com. And then Defending Democracy Together is the umbrella organization for the political and educational activities as apart from the Bulwark separate. That's a magazine publication. And so, Republican Voters Against Trump, you can go to that website, or Defending Democracy Together, and see what we're up to. And if you're an ex-Republican or an ex-Trump voter who wants to do a testimonial, you should certainly get in touch, and would be happy to do it. And finally, I'm on Twitter. We're still allowed to call it Twitter. I still call it Twitter.
Yeah.
At Bill Kristol. And so I try to, recommend articles there and share some of the stuff I've done, but also recommend other things, and not just from the Bulwark. So I feel like that's, for all the problems of Twitter and all, it does allow one to I found a lot of stuff that I wouldn't otherwise have found by following, some good people and seeing what they find interesting. So
not a Threads guy yet, huh?
I think I'm on that. I am on that. And I probably should do more of it. I just by the time it's time for
right.
these things, but
got to take a nap. Yes,
exactly.
That's great. Well, we'll be sure to put all those links in the show notes. This is great, Bill. I really appreciate seeing you again. I can't tell you how much of a treat this is for me, because it's like, in some way, this is going to sound stupid, but in some ways, I've been reading your work and hearing your analysis for years and years and years. It's almost like the equivalent of my comic books have come to life and they're talking to me.
Well, I think I'm flattered to be compared to a comic book, so thank you for that, Corey. And I really enjoyed this conversation. It was such a nice break from the normal 5-minute segments on TV, or even focusing only on the news of the day. And so keep up the good work.
Oh, thanks so much. Well, very much like I've told Roush and Pete Wehner, you have an open invitation. You officially, and if you happen to be in Southern California for the first night of Seder, you're officially invited to the Nathan Seder.
I think my wife would kill me if I disappeared sort of from here. We have various kids and family, but I will. Thanks for the invite anyway. So.
All right, you bet. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, remember to follow, rate, and review. And tell a friend about talking politics and religion without killing each other. We are easier to recommend than ever. Just tell your friend to go to their favorite podcast app and type in "without killing each other." Without the G in killing, without killing each other. If you just type that in, our purple logo will come up and they can get to the podcast on their favorite app. Or you can find me online at Corey S. Nathan. That's Corey. S as in Sam, Nathan, at Corey S. Nathan on all the apps, all the socials. I was gonna say I'm cool like that, but I'm not really cool. I got too much gray hair to be cool. But anyway, I'm on the apps, I'm on the socials, I'm on the Twitters. Anyway, now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.